If you want to understand how to use your DSLR or mirrorless camera and take better images, then learning how to shoot in manual is a great place to start.
In today's video, we're teaching all about shutter speed, one of the 3 fundamental controls that you have over your camera, and how your shutter speed really affects your images in a crucial way.
But before we jump into that, we want to introduce ourselves.
I'm Hunter.
And I'm Sarah.
And we're Hunter and Sarah Photography, professional husband and wife wedding photography team.
We're also educators, and our goal is to help photographers to build strong foundations in both their businesses and their personal lives so that they can run profitable and sustainable photography businesses.
So in case this is the first video that you have seen from this series, we just want to give you a brief intro as to why you might want to shoot in manual mode in the first place.
If you've owned a DSLR or a mirrorless camera for a little while now, you may have noticed that shooting with your camera in fully automatic mode is a lot like taking pictures with an iPhone. You point it at whatever you want to take a photo of, your camera does all of the work, and then you just snap the photo.
And when you're first starting out and you don't really know a lot about photography, this is kind of the best place to start, right? At the beginning, your camera is smarter than you, and when it comes to figuring out how to expose an image or how to figure out how much light to let into your image sensor, your camera's going to do a decent job. This is called setting the exposure, by the way, and like we said, in auto, your camera's going to do okay with this to start.
Yeah, but over time, if you just want to take better images, and especially if you want to become a professional photographer one day, you will need to learn how to take those reins away from your camera and start to control some of the exposure settings all on your own. That is where shooting in manual mode comes into play, and that's what this series is all about.
And speaking of series, last month we started this series by first introducing you to Aperture, then by teaching how to actually use it on portrait sessions and wedding days. So if you missed either of those videos, the link to check them out is going to be above, or you can always check out the Shooting in Manuals playlist on our YouTube channel.
But for now, let's dive into shutter speed and what it actually is. So, back in the days of film photography, when each image was exposed on a piece of photosensitive paper, the shutter was used to protect the film from being exposed to light until you were ready to take an image. Then, when you clicked that camera's shutter release button, the shutter would very quickly move out of the way to expose the film to light, and then it would very quickly move back into place to protect the film that had been exposed to a scene.
Now, the length of time that shutter actually stayed open, that is your shutter speed, right? It's usually measured in seconds or actually fractions of a second. It doesn't take very long for an image sensor or a piece of film to be exposed to light. So the most commonly used shutter speed for most portrait and wedding photographers is going to be between 1/100th of a second and 1/1000th of a second. So that means the image sensor or the piece of film is only going to be exposed to light for 10 or maybe even just a single millisecond.
Yeah, and even though digital cameras have replaced that photosensitive paper with a digital image sensor, the principle remains the same. The shutter speed is still a measure of how long you are exposing your image to the light for. Now, we don't recommend doing this. Again, we do not recommend doing this with your camera, but we have this old crop sensor lying around, and we don't mind if we get the image sensor a little dirty.
We don't use it anymore. It was just our very first camera, and I'm too nostalgic to throw it away.
Yeah.
But hopefully this should serve as a helpful visual for what we actually are talking about with shutter speed.
Yeah. So watch what happens when I set the shutter speed to 1/2 of a second. You can actually see that shutter open and close.
Now, watch what happens when Sarah takes the shutter speed from 1/2 of a second, which is a very slow shutter speed, to 1/250th of a second. This is a little bit more normal, a little bit faster of a shutter speed.
So,
Now, if you were even able to see that, it was so much quicker, right? That is what a faster shutter speed looks like compared to a slower shutter speed. Now, you can do this with your own camera with the lens on. It's a little bit harder to see, but you should never take a photo. You should never engage your sensor without a lens on with a camera that you actually care about, because you can get the sensor really dirty.
No. In case this is helpful, here is a chart with a handful of common shutter speeds. Just like with Aperture, you do not need to memorize these numbers, but just understand that smaller fractions mean that a shutter is open for less time. For example, 1/500th of a second is faster than 1/30th of a second.
So now that you know what shutter speed is, let's talk about what shutter speed does.
And just like with aperture, shutter speed has two main effects, and that first effect is light.
So as you make your shutter speed faster, so as you go from a 60th of a second to 1/250th of a second to 1/500th of a second, the curtain or that shutter that we were talking about before, the one that sits in front of your image sensor, is open for a smaller and smaller window of time, letting in less and less light. And so this in turn makes your images darker.
On the other hand, as you make your shutter speed slower from like 1/200th of a second to 1/100th of a second to like 1/50th of a second, the curtain or shutter is open for longer and longer, letting in more and more light. This makes your images brighter. So here is, that same diagram that we just showed a moment ago, but this time with shutter speed's effect on the exposure of your image taken into account.
And in case this is still too theoretical, let's look at an analogy that might help you intuitively understand a bit better how your shutter speed actually works, right? And so this is sort of the same analogy that we use with aperture. We're going to continue to use this analogy with shutter speed. Think about your lens as a hose that brings in ambient light, which is represented by these raindrops, into your camera's image sensor, which is represented by these buckets.
Now, at the top of the funnel is a cap that prevents water from getting into the lens most of the time. This is your shutter, and when that cap is closed, no light reaches your camera's image sensor.
So when you click the shutter release button to actually take a photo, your shutter jumps out of the way for a certain amount of time, and during that brief instant, light is reaching your image sensor. This is how your camera actually captures images.
Yeah, then after 1/60th of a second or 1/500th of a second, however long your shutter speed is set to, the shutter closes and light stops reaching your image sensor. That is how your camera takes an image.
So still, that might have been a little bit theoretical, or maybe you just want to see some images, right? So here is actual imagery of ours, so you can get a bit more intuitive sense of what we're talking about. So the image on the left was taken at a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second, and the image of the right was taken at 1/100th of a second, and all the other settings were the same. So hopefully it's pretty obvious that the image on the left, the one with the faster shutter speed, is much darker than the image on the right, which is the one with the slower shutter speed.
So, letting light in for a smaller window of time leads to less light. That's pretty intuitive. But just like with aperture and with ISO, shutter speed has a second effect on your images that's totally unique to your shutter speed.
So the way that shutter speed also affects your imagery is motion blur. So how fast your shutter speed is set to is going to affect whether motion blur is sort of perfectly, or whether motion that is occurring when you take your image is sort of like perfectly frozen in time, or whether it's a little blurry and fluid.
Yeah, so fast shutter speeds are going to freeze that motion in time, like this image on the left taken at 1/320th of a second, while slow shutter speeds, this is like
it's a tongue twister, all this whole video.
While slow shutter speeds allow motion to blur, like in the image taken at the right at 1/2 of a second. And here's that chart one final time with motion blur taken into account. We hope that you will screenshot this if you think that it will be helpful for you.
Now, in most cases, portrait and wedding photographers actually want to prevent motion blur, as it can be distracting, or it can kind of just make your image look like it was a misfire or a test shot. But in rare occurrences, and especially once you've mastered the basics, you can sort of experiment a little bit and strategically break the rules, right? If you've ever heard that old adage, you need to master the rules before you're allowed to break them. This is sort of one of those things, right? In order to capture images that might be a little more creative or artistic, like the kissing photo that we showed you just a minute ago with some motion blur.
Yeah, and whether you think that motion blurred kissing photo was artistic or not, that's totally fine. But whether you want to know how to replicate that effect or completely avoid it, you should turn into part 4, our next part of our shooting and manuals series next week, where we are going to break down all the theory that we just talked about in this video and teach you how to put that into practice and set your shutter speed for portrait sessions and wedding days.
But that's it for this week.
Thank you guys so much for watching. We genuinely hope that this video has helped you move just one step closer to understanding your camera and mastering manual photography.
Now, if you found this content helpful and want to continue to learn from us for free, we would really recommend that you join our Facebook community called Mastering the Wedding Photography Biz with Hunter and Sarah. This is a group we are using to build a community of other photographers who are also building their photography businesses and helping each other out along the way. And of course, you can like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
We share new content in that group almost every day, as well as updates when we post new videos like this one. And I think right now you're doing kind of weekly updates on Lightroom, are you not?
Hashtag Lightroom Basics coming every single week. Yeah. So anyway, we will be back next week on YouTube with another video in this series. But until then, happy shooting.